For the next few days, well, if you can even call them days, considering that we're so far south that the suns don't exactly set, we would wake up in the shelter, get some sustenance in us, check our gear, pack down the shelter, walk for 60 to 101 hours, set up the shelter, get some more substance in us, and then sleep. Kib, still stuck in his suit, asked John why he changed his inside footwear and undergarments every time they set up their camp. John responded, "Gotta keep the feet dry. It's an important step to hygiene when a human is in a survival situation." Kib asked, "Then what about the other garments? Or are you trying to show off to Lauchi?" Hearing this, Lauchi swayed away, a little shy as she realized the implication. Trust me, dude. If you understood the effects that cold has on the human body, you would know I am incapable of showing off. As far as the garments are concerned, humans need to thermoregulate our bodies, and to do this, our pores on our skin need to be as clear as possible. Now, bathing is the best way, but if you can't do that, changing garments keeps the oils and minerals from clogging up your pores, at least for a while. Bink chimed in, "I have a similar effect, yet I can just preen my feathers. Perhaps I should do that before resting." "Couldn't hurt." It had been about a week since they left the ship, and they noticed something in the distance. Looking through an odd technological scope, it was clear that the first sign of foliage is on the horizon. The group noticed, and were all excited, which was clear to see even through all the protective clothing. "Is that a good sign?" "You bet your ass." With renewed vigor, they made their way to the foliage. It was only scrub and wouldn't help much, but it is a sign that they are headed in the right direction. This is when they heard an odd sound, it low and deep in the background. Grouchy barely gets out, "What is—" before John said, "Ice." John keeps walking as they ask him what the hell did he mean. John has to explain that large pieces of ice can break off from an Arctic shelf. Where the ship crashed was over the ocean, so there is a chance, maybe rare but still there, that the ship is now in an ice floe, drifting off into the ocean, and the crew would have absolutely no idea. This made the other three remorseful until John told them, "Get your heads in the game," and he just kept walking. It was another night in the shelter as they hoped to see trees sometime soon. The next day, after a few hours of walking, they reached a tree line, but not before dropping balls deep into powder-like snow. Without snowshoes, the trek is going to slow down considerably now. John continued to break trail in front of everyone, being that his structure was stronger than the others, but the rest were breaking his ears and his patience as they really started to complain at this point. John just kept walking with his head on a swivel, looking around at everything, looking for anything he could use. That night, John was the first actually to fall asleep. This was aided by the fact that the sun actually was able to set down past the horizon now. The next 2 days, they continued to push through the trees, but the speed was considerably slower. John continued to break trail and make it easier for the others, but it led to falling a lot. On the morning of the next day, they noticed something in the trees. Movement. An animal that looked like a hornless caribou, but it was the size of a bull moose. When the creature and the group noticed each other, they both froze in place. Lauchi was the only one to turn away so she could reach for something to record. After looking at each other for a while, the creature and the group simply walked away from each other. After seeing such a large creature, the men were on edge and didn't want to speak as they continued to look around for danger. Lauchi studied the video with increased intrigue. That is, until John told her about a moose, a creature so dangerous that even the strongest of warriors would run from. The entire group became very nervous when John said, "And those aren't even the scariest things on Earth, not by a long shot." It was another 2 days before they found out why John had warned them about the large animals. As they packed up in the morning, there was a sudden sound. The group looked around, confused at what they just heard. When they looked over at John, his face was whiter than the snow they were walking through. Slowly, John reached down and picked up the pulse rifle, a weapon that uses an electric pulse to launch projectiles. Turning slowly, John gripped the weapon and slid the safety off, and kept perfectly silent as he slowly looked through the trees. These trees seemed to be an odd mix of conifers and willow, which did not allow for good visibility. Waiting for what seemed like hours, even though it was barely a minute, the sound of something charging through the trees echoed through the landscape. The group looked around, and John raised his rifle suddenly as something charged. The massive mammal charged into the group, sending Kib into a snowbank, crashing into the shelter. As the shelter collapsed, it seemed to sniff in the air as it stood over the remnants of the shelter itself, turned towards Lauchi, and snort heavily. That is when a familiar sound echoed through the morning air. The pulse rifle fired, and the large creature flinched for a moment before dropping onto the remains of the shelter. Standing nearly defiant, but totally focused, John had just put a solid projectile through the brainstem area of the creature. The creature had flinched from the impact, yet all its functions ceased after that, and it dropped. As Bink helped Kib out of the deep snow and checked on the damages to the suit, John walked up to the creature, poked it a few times with the dangerous end of his rifle, then slung the weapon behind his back and drew a very sharp blade. "What are you doing?" "This thing just destroyed our shelter. We're going to need a replacement." With expert precision, John butchered the animal, thankfully, realizing that the organs at least look very similar to what he's used to, so he can figure out what's what, and in similar placement. Lauchi watches and nearly vomits where she stands at the sight of John casually skinning the animal and packaging the meat along with the organs. While he does this, Bink and Kib look through the supplies to see what they have left. The shelter itself is a complete loss, as well as one of the cots. The only other piece of equipment that is a loss is their cooking stove. Well, not the stove, but at least the charger itself is gone, meaning they will only have the ability to heat their food until the power cell completely runs out. "That won't be an issue, just an inconvenience," John would tell them. Realizing they need to keep moving, they leave the broken pieces of the shelter and cot and replace their position inside the carts with the newly acquired food. Once packed, John cleanses his hands in the snow and then starts walking. They do not stop that night as the air is filled with the sounds of the same animal. The group is clearly nervous. Even John is as he clutches that pulse rifle in his hand. When Lauchi asks later on why they're making so much noise, no one answers for a moment. But then she insists. Bink is the first one to respond. "It's the same reason why any man makes a lot of noise, especially in a bar." "They're drunk and stupid?" Lauchi asks. "You're half right. But what makes them stupid?" "I don't know. Men are always acting stupid in front of me." Bink turns back and looks at Lauchi, then looks up at Kib. He ruffles his feathers, which is his species' version of simply shaking his head in a version of, "Oh, geez, I can't believe she doesn't figure that." "What?" "They're in rut," John yells out. "Rut? Doesn't your species have a mating cycle?" "Yes, but... Oh." "It even happens to my species. We have to separate ourselves from others, as we will get very aggressive. That is the truth. In fact, there are only two known sapient species that do not have one. Manarians and, um, who else? Humans. They're trying to be polite, not saying it because of our past. I am unfamiliar with what you speak. The men are quiet for a minute and don't even respond. Could someone please enlighten me? I will give you a condensed version, John says, as it was a mistake that most species would only want to remember to assure they don't make the same mistake twice. John was quiet for a minute as Lauchi looked at the other two. Both seemed to have their heads down in a bit of shame. Before she could ask again, John started talking. It happened a few decades before your species was discovered. Humanity had just been informed about the rest of the species as we had finally reached out to the stars. At first, we acted like children, all excited about the new toys and the chance to explore beyond our own world. Well, things seemed good for a while. As we slowly reached out, the other species studied us just like we studied them, and it wasn't very long before they found out that we were the only species without a mating season. This led many of our people being invited to areas where there would be incentivized to mate, out of rut, that is. Truth be told, this was primarily human males being incentivized, but they underestimated the desires of human females as well, and that led to some problems too. What started all the issues is that human males are mainly interested in visual cues. We don't do all the other stuff with smell and things like that. Many species do not have an outer appearance that can excite the human. This is when chemical compounds are used, sometimes forced on, and it's rather easy to go through the process of mating. And many xeno females would do this, at least for a while, until the incident. He paused to calm his heart, as trying to trudge through hip-deep snow and talk at the same time was starting to get to him. Catching his breath, he continued. You see, as it turns out, humans can reproduce with most species in the universe, at least most sentient species. In fear of the resulting offspring, they would force humans to serve as slaves or pleasure slaves until mating season. When that season arrived, no matter how long it was, for a day, a week, a month, sometimes a couple of years, the human would be kept in solitary confinement where no one could reach them, as I guess you could say a safety measure. Unfortunately, this practice of taking humans became so common that abductions would take place. We call it human trafficking, even with those far too young to mate with. John realized that his rage was starting to get the better of him, so he took a few breaths to calm himself down and try to adjust what he was going to say. The only bright side to this whole thing was the massive amounts of wealth floating in from tourists. Most had a little interest in our cultures, histories, technologies, or arts. Instead, most of them simply believed that Earth was some sort of pleasure palace planet where they could just choose a slave and use them, abuse them, and then take them without consequences. They were wrong. Many fights broke out as we humans resisted being slaves. A few humans did embrace this whole being a pleasure slave because of its obvious benefits, though the majority of the species remembered the barbarism of our past. At that point, it was our strength that saved us. Before our planet could be picked clean, we fought back. First by restrictions, then by force. You see, humanity may not have a season to mate, but we also do not have a season in which we make war. We fought back, at first with words, then with force. Yet it was the political arena that won our independence away from everyone else to make sure they did not come and try to pick our planet clean. Our spooks had collected enough information to embarrass the entire council, all 69 member species. With images, video, documentation, and witnesses, each member was brought to their knees in embarrassment. Embarrassment worked that well? For anybody in their position of authority? It would cause such a scandal that even the lowest of their society will be calling for their removal, if not the removal of their head. John then turned slightly before saying something else. Should I enlighten you on a few of the details? Please don't, Bink jumped in. Yes, I am already nauseous at the thought, and I do not want to retch in this suit. They then walked in silence for the rest of the day. As the suns began to set, John told them to stop near a tree so they could set up camp. Climbing under the tree, he begins to dig while going through instructions to the others. Realizing that they will be sleeping in a freaking snow hole, they all protested. That was until John asked, Would you rather keep walking? They all aided him in setting all the materials up, including the remaining cot. Bink and Lauchi would remain on the cot. Kib would simply remain in his suit. He actually didn't need the cot. And John laid out the hide of the creature with the fur facing up, and then put a few more blankets on it, before laying down and covering himself with the rest of the blankets. The process was performed every night, and every morning they packed up and had to do something that disgusted all of them. They were told to urinate on the underside of the hide, the side without any fur. John insisted, as he proceeded to be the first to urinate on it. He claimed that this would tan the hide, and they were confused. The others hesitated, but followed suit before letting it dry near the fire for about an hour. The group didn't understand this until the hide became significantly easier to roll up as it tanned itself and became much more pliable. By this time, they had reached something that made them all happy. They had finally passed the snow and they had reached the rainforest that was there, a temperate rainforest, yet still out of the snow. Finally, they all thought to themselves, now it's time to make some real progress. Bink, Lauchi, and John were all glad to get out of their snow boots, though it is still far too cold for Kib to get out of his suit. To celebrate reaching beyond the snow, they stopped for a day to rest. Searching, John found a very large hollowed-out stump of a fallen tree. It's actually large enough to fit them all inside with room to spare. Before they could relax, though, John insisted that they cover all exposed openings minus one. They then collected wood and tried to get it as dry as possible, of course. And John got a fire going to cook the meat that they had in their carts. Lauchi instinctively stayed away from the fire, as her species really does not like heat. Yet it was nice to be warm for a change. They discovered a very small stream, and John collected water. After he was done, he began to clean his clothing articles, in particular his socks, before hanging them near the fire to dry. For a species that claims to handle all climates, you seem to have a lot of work to achieve this, Bink said as he watched the entire process. Yep, but it's better than the alternative. True, human, true. At this point, John had finished cleaning the hide. Though not totally tanned, it was far improved. John noted that the fur actually was similar to bear fur. When he had to explain to the rest of the group what a bear is, all three members had much more respect for the squishy humans. During their day of rest, John double-checked all the equipment as the others slept, reliving the previous night in his mind as they all enjoyed the spoils of their hunt. Though hesitant to eat at first, the rush of proteins and irons once they started to chow down had them all buzzing with energy. This had them mostly up all night playing cards, John laughed as he remembered how Kib was a natural talent for card games, thinking to himself, if he had been actually playing for money, he'd be in so much debt. After packing everything back up, John crawled back inside the cave. Feeding the fire, he could see Bink shuffle slightly at the sound of wood cracking as he seemed to be simply squatted down as though some sort of bird normally would, with his feathers all ruffled out. Kib was stretched out long ways as his body relaxed, and there was Lauchie, spread out on the hide, the one she swore up and down she would never sleep on after pissing on it. Yet she fell asleep after laying down on it, saying, "So soft." John thought, they need the rest, as he kept his pulse rifle on his lap next to the fire. He thought to himself a little more, from here on out, at least their direction is simple. I can keep this compass tucked away, 'cause now we just gotta follow the river.